What if the Quakers never existed? Part 2. When we last left off, the South had just conquered the Louisiana Territory and Canada west of Quebec. But let's briefly turn our gaze away from the New World to the Old. The reason I mainly focused on the United States in the New World last time was that the Quakers' effect on America was much greater, earlier, and more subtle than their effect on Britain. The Quakers had minor changes on British politics in the 18th century, and they were originally going to be in this video, but I realized that they weren't important to the flow of this alternate history. No one would have cared, it would have taken up too much time, I didn't really know enough about the topic to make an accurate simulation. However, one aspect of politics the Quakers did not stint on is abolition. For much of the 18th century, the Quakers were basically the only people campaigning for abolition of slaves in the Anglo-Saxon world. They created the movement the sensitive new middle classes filled and helped push through to success in the early 19th century. Britain would probably outlaw slavery at the same time as France and other continental nations in this timeline, around 1840 or 50. New England would likely outlaw slavery in the early 19th century, without its economy directly dependent on slavery, and with New England being the heart of the abolitionist movement in our timeline in the 19th century. But for the South, it would probably be a while. Without Quakers or the anti-slavery North, they would likely not outlaw slavery until the 1930s, when machines could do the jobs that slaves used to be able to do cheaper. The Quakers were very instrumental in the creation of the English banking system. Since they had no sense of nobility, were a tightly knit community, and unpaid debts were seen as sinful, it was a community where you'd be sure people would honor their debts. In this timeline, the English banking system takes longer to be created, and the Scottish one is preeminent in England for some time. Also, the most industrialized part of Britain was also the most Quaker part of England. This was not a coincidence. The Quakers were some of Britain's first industrialists. This was mainly for the same reasons of why they created Britain's first banks. And this is partially why Sheffield, Manchester, and Leeds became the cities they did in our timelines, and why the northwest of England was the center of industrialization. In this timeline, Britain still industrializes, but it's slightly less so, and its center would be less centered in northwestern England, but it would be more balanced across more of England. Scotland might have more leverage in this union, and in this timeline, Scotland might have declared independence from England at some point in the 20th century, without the fear that without it, their economy would collapse. Before we get back to America, just a fun fact, Cadbury was founded by Quakers, so in this timeline, Cadbury would never exist, and so it would be replaced by a different British chocolate company. Back in America, the South would continue to expand across the continent. Just like in our timeline, Mexico would invite southern settlers to solidify their control of Texas. And just like in our timeline, the Texans would rebel in favor of their Native American government, because they would be angry at the lack of democracy in Mexico. The Mexican War was a pretty easy win for the U.S., so we can assume that even without New England, the South could have easily won. In our timeline, the South wanted to annex another top third of Mexico to make more space for slave states. The North blocked them, but in this timeline, where New England wasn't part of the South, and where the Midwest would be settled by effectively Southerners, the South would have annexed the northern third of Mexico. Also in our timeline, the South wanted to conquer the Caribbean and Central America to, you guessed it, make more space for slave states. In our timeline, again, the North blocked them for fear that the South would grow too large and it never happened. And again, in a union made mainly by Southerners, they would have conquered parts of Central America and the Caribbean. God, history repeats itself, or more accurately, the same issues are fought over endlessly. The South would not purchase Alaska because the Russians would not sell it. In our timeline, the Russians sold Alaska to the Americans because they were worried the British would seize it from them in a future war if they didn't. However, with the South controlling nearly the entire continent, this would not be a worry. The Russians would have probably not sold it, or have actually sold it to the British for fear that the Americans would have seized it. If not, the Americans or British would have seized it during the Russian Civil War. New England would probably become an American Netherlands, a small coastal industrial nation based off trade. It would probably have a higher standard of living than the South, but it would not be a huge power like the South either. Immigration would be very different depending on which American nation we're talking about. The Quakers asked the Germans to settle in the New World in the late 17th century in our timeline, since there were many German Quakers, or peoples of friendly religions, in Germany. They settled Pennsylvania, and when they migrated west, they created the so-called German Belt. In this timeline, the Germans would probably still immigrate to America, but at a lesser date and lesser number, not becoming the first or second largest ethnic group in America depending on how you count like they did in our timeline. Fun side note, the Quakers invited the ancestors of the Amish to the New World, and they only survived there, slowly going extinct in Europe. In this timeline, the Amish go extinct in the early 20th century in Germany. The South would likely welcome any white immigrants as a form of keeping down the blacks. The South only really became anti-Catholic after the Civil War, and so would probably welcome the Irish and to a lesser extent the Italians, who would be trusted less due to their South European ancestry. New England, meanwhile, would be much meaner to immigrants, since they would fear a large population of immigrants would destroy their small country's culture without the rest of the country to balance it out. This would likely result in Irish immigrants likely becoming an underclass in New England, and they would form tight immigration policies to keep out the Italians later. The sheer size of the South would be stunning. It would probably stretch from Panama to the Arctic, with only a few Central American countries not under its control. In the late 19th century, this would terrify New England and Britain. To have a massive, aggressive country nearby would have resulted in much tension, even though the South would probably be weaker than our timeline's U.S. when push would come to shove without the huge industry the U.S. had in our timeline. New England and Britain would form an alliance against the South. This would likely never result in actual war, because the South would probably be happy territory-wise and wouldn't want to expand in Northeast due to the climate, and the British would be too worried over the Russians and Germans. Plus, it would be suicidal for the New Englanders to start a war without Britain's backing against the South. In the late 19th century, the South's economy would skyrocket. The rise in agricultural prices meant this was a pattern seen worldwide in agriculturally dependent nations. This is why this time period is seen as the economic golden age of agricultural nations like Argentina or Brazil. Slavery would make southern agricultural exports even more competitive. For what feels like the first time in this show, I'm going to say that the Allies would have still won World War I. Britain would be less industrialized, but it would still be one of the most industrialized nations on Earth, and would be more than a match for the Germans. New England, being a staunch British ally, would have fought in the war from the beginning, and would have made up any slack the British would have lost in industry. The South, meanwhile, would have been roped into the conflict like the US in our timeline, for much of the same reasons. By the time the American role was decisive, the Germans were already worn down, and thus even a weaker America could have been decisive. The South's economy would have collapsed after World War I. This is because the price of agricultural goods, which the South would have based its economy off, collapsed due to the war. This is a pattern we saw in agriculturally dependent South American nations. America escaped this pattern, however, as in industrial nations did extremely well after World War I, or at least the ones that won the war. Thus, the economic success of the North balanced out the economic failures of the South in our timeline in the 1920s. In the South, the Great Depression would start in 1919. When World War II would start, the weaker U.S. would change the war significantly. For the sake of the timeline, I'm going to assume the South still controls the Philippines as a leftover from some war against the Spanish, and so the Americans still get involved in the war. The war would have different results in different theaters. In Europe, I consider the Americans decisive, but the Russians in reality were by far the most important factor to victory on the European front. If the Americans were strong enough to win the Battle of the Atlantic, bomb Germany, and waylay the Germans in the West, the Russians could do the rest. In the Pacific, with the Americans being far weaker, the Japanese would have probably won the war. Probably with the Americans only having a slight industrial advantage, the Americans would probably fight the Japanese to a standstill and sign a truce in the mid-40s, when they would know neither side could win. After World War II, the South would not have had the strength to compete with the Soviets in Europe in a Cold War, and with a weak, non-industrial, declining economy would have fallen into a period of isolationism. The Soviets would have taken over Europe and become the most powerful nation on Earth. Britain would have survived on a knife's edge, holding onto its commonwealths for survival. The South would have probably turned out like a South American country, a huge nation with a weak economy. Out of all of the agriculturally dependent nations at the start of the century, none of them did well in the 20th century, and it's easy to assume a similar thing would have happened to the South. I don't know if there would have been a fascist dictatorship like Perón in Argentina, due to the population's anger about their continued lost wealth. New England, meanwhile, would basically be a European nation placed in America, a small, densely populated, economically strong nation with fairly left-wing politics, if you take out the whole Irish apartheid thing. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next timeline. Thank you.